Here's something that'll keep you up at night. Australia's economy hasn't actually grown in years. Yeah, you heard that right. The government tells you GDP is up, jobs are being created, everything looks rosy. But here's the dirty secret. They're lying to you with statistics. The only reason the numbers look good is because they keep adding more people. It's like saying you're getting richer because you invited 10 more guests to split the same pizza. Everyone gets less, but hey, the total pizza count stays the same, right? This isn't just bad policy. This is a full-blown Ponzi scheme, and every Australian is caught in it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how your government turned the lucky country into a feudal state where landlords are the new nobles and you're the peasant paying rent forever. Stick around, because what comes next will change how you see everything. Part 1. The miracle that wasn't. How growth became an illusion. Let's talk about the greatest magic trick in Australian politics. For decades, your leaders have stood up and bragged about the economy. We're growing, they say. Look at our GDP. Look at our job numbers. We're the envy of the world. And on paper, they're not wrong. Australia avoided the 2008 financial crisis. It dodged recessions that crushed other countries. The numbers look incredible. But here's what they don't tell you. It's all fake. Well, not fake exactly. The numbers are real. But they're meaningless. Because Australia discovered the ultimate cheat code for economic growth, and it's called the population Ponzi scheme. Here's how it works. Imagine you run a coffee shop. You make $10,000 a month, not bad. But you want to tell investors you're growing. So next month you open a second location. Now you make $20,000 total. Growth, success, except you're not actually more profitable per store. You didn't get better at making coffee. You didn't innovate. You just added more locations. And if each location makes less profit because you're spreading yourself thin, well, you just don't mention that part. That's Australia's economy. The growth is real, but it's hollow. It's not coming from making better products, or working smarter, or inventing new things. It's coming from one thing, adding more people. For 35 years before 2005, Australia's net overseas migration, that's the number of people moving in minus the people moving out, averaged around 70,000 per year. That's a decent, sustainable number. The country could absorb that. Infrastructure could keep up. Housing could keep pace. Schools, hospitals, roads, everything scaled naturally. Then something changed in 2005. Migration tripled. Suddenly Australia wasn't adding 70,000 people a year. It was adding over 200,000. That's 1 million extra people every 3 years. Every single 3 years. Think about that. In less than a generation, Australia added the equivalent of multiple major cities' worth of population. Sydney's population is around 5 million. Australia has added nearly 2 Sydneys in population since 2005. Now, politicians love this. And here's why. It makes them look competent. When migration explodes and you add 1 million people, those people need houses. They need food. They need phones, cars, furniture, everything. So businesses boom. Construction goes crazy. Retailers see sales jump. And most importantly, GDP, that magic number that decides whether a politician looks good or bad, keeps climbing. The Prime Minister stands up and says, "Under my leadership, the economy grew 3%. The Treasurer brags about job creation. Everyone pats themselves on back. Election won. Careers secured. But here's the sick joke. You're not actually better off. Your living standard hasn't improved. In fact, it's gotten worse. Because while the total size of the economy grew, it grew by adding more people, not by making each person more prosperous. It's the pizza problem. Same amount of value, more people splitting it. Go back to the 1950s and 60s. Australia had something different then. The country protected its manufacturing industry. Tariffs kept foreign competition at bay, so Australian factories thrived. Steelworks, textile mills, car plants. These weren't just businesses, they were institutions. They employed hundreds of thousands of people in stable, well-paying jobs. And here's the kicker. One income could support a family. One parent could work while the other raised kids, and they could buy a house, take vacations, save for retirement. The Australian dream wasn't a fantasy. It was the default setting. What happened? Globalization came knocking, and Australia opened the door wide. Industry protections got stripped away. Factories closed. Manufacturing jobs vanished. The economy that once made things started buying things instead. Australia became an importer, not a producer. But politicians needed growth numbers to stay positive, so they found the cheat code: migration. Flood the country with people, and GDP stays up even as productivity, the actual measure of economic health, stagnates or falls. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is policy. It's documented. It's deliberate. Governments on both sides, Labour and Liberal, figured out that population growth buys them time. It delays the reckoning. It makes charts point up instead of down. And in politics, up is all that matters. But here's where it gets dark. This isn't just a bad strategy. It's a Ponzi scheme. And like every Ponzi scheme in history, it only works if the base keeps expanding. You need new investors to pay off the old ones. You need new arrivals to prop up the economy for the people who came before. Growth has to be infinite, or the whole thing collapses. Except growth can't be infinite. Australia's a big country, sure, but it's mostly desert. The habitable land is limited. Water is scarce. Infrastructure is expensive. At some point, the scheme hits a wall. And when it does, everyone who bought into the illusion, which is pretty much everyone, gets crushed. So when you hear politicians celebrate record growth, ask yourself, growth for who? The country's GDP might be up, but your wallet isn't thicker. Your commute is longer, your rent is higher, your job is less secure. That's not growth, that's extraction. You're being squeezed so the numbers look good. And if growth is a lie, what else have they been lying about? That's the question that unravels everything. Because once you pull this thread, the whole system starts to fall apart. And that's exactly where we're going next. Part 2. When growth lies, the per capita recession nobody wants to admit. All right, let's get technical for a second, but don't worry, I'll make this simple. There's a term economists use that politicians desperately hope you never learn: per capita recession. Here's what it means. GDP measures the total size of the economy. It's the sum of everything everyone produces. If that number goes up, they call it growth. But per capita GDP measures the economy per person. It's total GDP divided by population. And that number tells you whether people are actually getting richer or just treading water. Australia's been in a per capita recession for years. Total GDP looks fine. The pie is growing. But the pie per person? Shrinking. You're getting a smaller slice even though they keep telling you there's more pie. Let's use 2025 as an example. The government will brag about positive GDP growth, maybe 2%, maybe 3%. Sounds great, right? Except the population also grew by nearly 2% because of migration, so GDP per person, flat. Or worse, negative if you account for inflation. Translation: the average Australian is not better off than they were a year ago. They might even be worse off. But the headline says, Australia's economy grows, and everyone moves on. This matters. A lot. Because per capita recession means the country isn't getting more productive. Productivity is the golden metric. It's output per hour of work. If productivity rises, you can work the same hours and produce more value, which means higher wages, more prosperity, better living standards. But Australia's productivity has stagnated for years. The economy grows by adding more people and making them work more hours, not by working smarter. It's brute force growth. Throw more bodies at the problem, and that creates a trap. When productivity stalls, wages stall. You're working just as hard, but you're not getting ahead. In fact, you're falling behind because while wages flatline, the cost of everything else keeps climbing. Rent, groceries, energy, healthcare, all going up. Your paycheck? Staying put. Australia now has some of the worst wage growth versus cost of living increases in the OECD. That's the club of wealthy developed countries. Since the pandemic, the gap has widened into a chasm. Prices are rising faster than wages, which means your purchasing power, the actual buying ability of your money, is shrinking. This is extraction. The system is taking value out of your pocket instead of creating new value. You work harder, pay more, and get less. And it's not because you're lazy or unskilled. It's because the economic model is designed to extract, not to build. Here's where the Ponzi logic kicks in. In a healthy economy, growth comes from innovation and productivity gains. You invent something, streamline a process, educate workers better, and boom, everyone benefits. But in a Ponzi economy, growth comes from the next batch of people propping up the last batch. New migrants arrive. They need housing, so landlords profit. They need jobs, so wages get suppressed because labour supply just increased. They spend money, so businesses get a short-term boost. But the infrastructure doesn't expand fast enough. Services get stretched. Quality of life declines. And then you need even more migrants to keep the numbers looking good, which stretches things further, and the cycle accelerates. Each wave props up the last, but everyone's worse off underneath. That's the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. It only works if the base keeps growing, and eventually the base can't grow anymore. Meanwhile, household debt skyrockets. Australians are some of the most indebted people on earth. Mortgages, credit cards, personal loans. People borrow just to maintain their lifestyle because wages aren't cutting it anymore, and debt makes you fragile. One economic shock, a job loss, a rate hike, a medical emergency, and you're toast. The system traps you. You can't save, you can't get ahead. You're stuck on a treadmill that speeds up every year. And the whole time, politicians are on TV saying, "Look how well we're doing, GDP is up." But who cares if GDP is up if your life is harder? If your rent takes half your paycheck? If you can't afford to have kids because childcare costs more than a mortgage? If you're one layoff away from disaster? This is the per capita recession. It's invisible in the headlines, but it's crushing in your bank account. And it explains so much of the anxiety, frustration, and anger simmering in Australian society. People feel like they're working harder for less, and they're right. The data backs it up. The scariest part? The government knows. Bureaucrats in Canberra see the same numbers you do. They know productivity is stagnant. They know wages are lagging. They know per capita GDP is flat or negative. But they keep the migration tap open because turning it off means admitting the growth was fake all along. It means facing the collapse they've been delaying. So they double down, keep the scheme running, keep the population growing, keep the GDP number positive, worry about the consequences later, or better yet, let the next government deal with it. But consequences don't wait, they accumulate. And nowhere are they more visible, more brutal, than in housing. Because if wages are stagnant and living costs are rising, there's only one place left for the system to extract maximum value: the place you live. That's where the Ponzi scheme cashes out. That's where the trap snaps shut. And that's what we're diving into next. Part 3. The polite feudal state, who owns the land, owns the future. Here's a fun fact. In medieval Europe, wealth didn't come from working. It came from owning land. Kings, lords, nobles, they owned the soil, and everyone else paid them for the privilege of living on it. You could work yourself to death farming that land, but you'd never own it. You were a peasant. They were the aristocracy, and that gap was permanent. Welcome to modern Australia. Different era, same structure. In today's Australia, wealth doesn't come from your job. It doesn't come from your skills, your education, or how hard you work. It comes from owning property. And if you don't own property, you're locked out of wealth creation entirely. You're the new peasant class paying rent to the new lords. Let's talk about the bank of mum and dad. It's become a cliche, but it's not a joke. It's a structural reality. Home ownership in Australia now depends almost entirely on whether your parents can help you, not whether you have a good job, not whether you're financially responsible, not whether you work hard and save. None of that matters anymore. The average house price in Sydney is over $1 million. In Melbourne, it's not far behind. Even in smaller cities, prices have exploded beyond what a single income, or even two incomes, can reasonably afford. The deposit alone can take a decade to save if you're paying rent, and by the time you've saved it, prices have climbed even higher. You're chasing a target that moves faster than you can run. So who's buying? People whose parents give them $100,000, $200,000, sometimes more for a deposit. People who inherit property. People who already own and are leveraging equity to buy more. The wealthy get wealthier. Everyone else gets priced out. And here's where it gets feudal. If you can't buy, you rent. Forever. You're paying someone else's mortgage while they build equity. You're funding their wealth while accumulating none of your own. Every month, money flows from your pocket to theirs. You work, they profit, and the gap between you widens. This isn't accidental. It's designed. The population Ponzi scheme turbocharged this process. When you add 1 million people every 3 years, you create artificial demand for housing. Supply can't keep up, construction is slow, land is limited, zoning laws are restrictive, so prices go up, and up, and up. Developers love this. They're not building affordable housing. Why would they? There's no money in affordable. They're building luxury apartments and high-end developments. In Sydney, entire neighbourhoods that used to be middle class are now playgrounds for the rich. Harbourside suburbs, inner city enclaves, places where average Australians used to live are now beyond reach. Meanwhile, vacancy rates in major cities hover around 1.2%. That's insanely low. It means rental supply is so tight that landlords can charge whatever they want. You either pay or you're homeless. And because migration keeps demand high, there's no relief coming. The result? Housing has become the primary wealth escalator in Australia. Own property and you're climbing. Don't own property and you're falling. It's binary, it's brutal, and it's permanent. Forecasts for 2026 predict another 5 to 10% rise in house prices despite high interest rates. Think about that. Rates are supposed to cool the market. They're supposed to make borrowing expensive and slow down price growth. But even that isn't working because demand, fueled by population growth, is so intense that prices keep climbing anyway. And here's the kicker. Politicians benefit from this. Many of them own multiple properties. They're landlords themselves. They profit from the very system they're supposed to regulate. So why would they fix it? Why would they flood the market with affordable housing and crash their own investment portfolios? They won't, and they haven't. What you're witnessing is the emergence of a new class divide. Not rich versus poor, not educated versus uneducated. It's landlords versus renters, owners versus non-owners, the people who got in versus the people who got locked out. This is neo-feudalism. The landlords are the new nobility. They own the land, they collect the rent, they pass their wealth to their children, who become the next generation of landlords. And renters are serfs. They work to pay rent. They move when the landlord decides to sell or renovate or jack up the price. They have no security, no equity, no future. And just like in medieval times, this system is inherited. If your parents own property, you'll probably own property. If they don't, you probably won't. Social mobility, the idea that you can work your way up, dies when wealth becomes tied to inheritance instead of effort. The psychological toll is brutal. Entire generations are delaying families because they can't afford space for kids. Mental health is tanking. Stress, anxiety, depression skyrocketing. And why wouldn't they? When you're working full-time and still can't afford a stable place to live, hope evaporates. Social cohesion fractures. Resentment builds. The young look at the old and see a generation that bought houses for 3 times their salary and now lectures them about avocado toast. The divide isn't just economic, it's existential. And all of this traces back to the population Ponzi scheme. Migration inflates demand. Demand inflates prices. Prices create a wealth gap. The gap becomes permanent, and the government calls it economic success. But it's not success. It's a heist. The land is being consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, and everyone else is being reduced to paying tenants. It's feudalism with better PR. And if you think housing is the only battlefield where this scheme plays out, you haven't seen the full picture. Let's keep going. Part 4. Factories to cranes, the narrowing of a nation. Rewind to the 1950s and 60s. Australia made things: steel, cars, textiles, machinery. Walk into a store, and chances were good that the product was made in Australia by Australians. Manufacturing created stable, well-paying jobs. A kid could leave school at 15, start training, and retire from the same company 40 years later with a pension. It was predictable, it was secure, it was dignified, and it created economic resilience. When the world hit turbulence, Australia had a buffer. Then came globalization. Tariffs dropped, protections vanished, foreign goods poured in cheaper. Australian factories couldn't compete. Holden shut down in 2017. Ford stopped in 2016. Toyota followed. Entire industries collapsed. Towns became ghost towns. And what replaced manufacturing, construction and services? Australia became an economy that builds houses and serves coffee. Construction exploded because someone has to build homes for 1 million new people every 3 years. But construction is fragile. When the property market cools, construction collapses, and services are low wage. Baristas and retail workers aren't making factory money. Their jobs are casual, no sick leave, no security. They're interchangeable. Then there are the universities. Once bastions of education, they've become corporate parasites. They realised they could make fortunes selling degrees to international students. Not because the education was world-class, but because the degree came with a pathway to permanent residency. Universities became migration agents. Tuition fees from international students now fund huge chunks of university budgets. Administrators rake in salaries over $1 million. But educational quality? Secondary. The priority is maximising enrolment, which means lowering standards. Universities profit from migration while churning out graduates into an oversaturated job market, which suppresses wages. Everyone loses except the administrators and the government. Australia's economy has narrowed. It depends on population growth for construction demand and on international students for university revenue. Remove those two pillars and the economy wobbles. This isn't resilience. It's fragility disguised as growth. When shocks come, they hit harder because the economy has no depth. Manufacturing had redundancy, but construction and services, they're shallow. When demand drops, there's nothing underneath to catch the fall. Australia trades capacity for concrete. It builds houses instead of building industries. Cranes dominate the skyline, and politicians point to them as proof of success. But those cranes aren't building a future. They're building dependency. Because when the population stops growing, and it will, the cranes stop moving. And then what? Part 5. The Hidden Bill. Infrastructure, environment, and life squeezed at the edges. Here's what happens when you add 1 million people every 3 years without planning. Everything breaks. Infrastructure gets overwhelmed. Commutes get longer. Sydney and Melbourne now have some of the longest average commute times in the developed world. People spend hours sitting in cars or crammed into trains. That's not productivity. That's punishment. Hospital wait times blow out. Schools are overcrowded. Utilities spike. Energy costs rise because demand outstrips supply. Water becomes scarce. Australia is the driest inhabited continent, and adding millions of people strains every resource. And then there's the environment. Between 1970 and 2016, global wildlife populations fell by an average of 68%. Some Australian species have seen their numbers plummet by up to 97%. Let me repeat that. 97%. Nearly wiped out. The primary cause? Habitat loss. When you add millions of people, you need land. So you clear forests, you pave wetlands, you bulldoze ecosystems, and the animals that live there, they disappear. The moral stakes are staggering. Economic policy, decisions made by bureaucrats in air-conditioned offices, literally erases life. Entire species gone because someone decided endless growth was more important than sustainability. Vegetation cover declines, so cities get hotter. Green space vanishes, replaced by concrete. Parks become scarce. Pollution rises. Air quality worsens. None of this is natural. It's policy-driven. The government chose high migration. Every negative outcome, traffic, pollution, species loss, infrastructure collapse, is a side effect of that choice. The system extracts value from everything. From your time stuck in traffic, from your wallet paying higher bills, from the land bulldozed for suburbs, from the animals whose habitats vanish, and it's framed as progress. Politicians talk about nation building and growth. They point to construction, population, GDP, and call it success. They don't mention the commutes, the species loss, the crumbling infrastructure. Growth that destroys living standards isn't growth, it's extraction, and extraction has a limit. Part 6. Managing the optics, caps, targets, and the illusion of control. 150 words. The government knows the population scheme is unpopular, so they make a big show of managing migration. They announce caps. They introduce targets. It's all theatre. The permanent migration programme sits at around 185,000 per year. That's still massive. More than double the historical average. The student visa cap is 295,000. Even with caps, population keeps growing. If they cut migration significantly, the economy would wobble, construction would slow, universities would bleed revenue, GDP growth would stall, and voters would panic. So politicians tweak around the edges. They calm public concern without actually changing the trajectory. The migration stays high, the Ponzi rolls on. But systems like this don't stabilize, they escalate. Eventually growth hits a wall, and when it does, the collapse is spectacular. The question isn't if, it's when. Part 7. The collapse. Nobody wants to say out loud, and the way out. Every Ponzi scheme ends the same way. The base stops expanding, the math breaks, everyone loses. Australia's population Ponzi will collapse when costs outgrow benefits, and the human cost will be brutal. But these outcomes are not accidental. They're the logical result of deliberate policy. The government chose this path, and if bad policy caused the problem, good policy can fix it. Look at Germany, Japan, Scandinavian countries. They run high-skill, high-wage economies without depending on massive migration. Economic policy is a moral decision. It's a choice about what kind of society survives. The question is, how much longer will you let them?